Hey everyone, it's Matt from Train Sim Society and welcome back to the channel, or welcome if you're new. So this is a follow-up video to a topic or a tool that I have already covered. This is the TSW Route Annotations app by Winserton, which also implements live and historic weather into TSW6. This has honestly been one of the most game-changing tools for the sim. Now, I'm not going to rehash everything from that previous video where I go more in depth as to what it is and what it could provide for your TSW experience. So if you haven't seen that first video, I definitely recommend watching that one first. This video is just going to assume you already know what the tool does and why it is so useful. But what I want to focus on here is what has changed since that last video. So there has been a lot of development within a short amount of time, and the developer Winserton has been incredibly responsive to community feedback. Some bugs were reported, including some detailed ones from myself and other users, and they have been fixed. So I'm going to cover that as well, but let's go through what's new, starting from the earlier updates and working our way to the most recent. So version 3.4 brought some nice quality of life improvements. The weather tab was moved to be the first tab since more people interact with that, saving you a click. The POI editor got some attention too. Crossing road and road underpass POI types were added with dedicated icons, and built-in locations are now hidden from the editor by default, which makes working with your own custom points much easier. Now, the biggest addition in 3.4 was the wetness simulation. So the app now controls the wetness slider, which will add a ton of realism. So wetness is affected by current precipitation, obviously, but also by precipitation within the last 3 hours. So you could spawn into clear weather and still have wet surfaces because according to the weather data for that area, it maybe rained recently. The temperature will also play a role too, so hotter temps dry things out a lot faster, and humidity affects all of this as well. High humidity with colder weather creates condensation, making the world wetter, and if there's snow cover near freezing temps, the ground gets wet as it melts. The hotter it gets, the wetter it becomes from melting snow. Now, version 3.5 brought a major overhaul to the weather overlay. So wind information from live data was added, though it's not applied in TSW since it's not available in the DTG API. The overlay itself got expanded with a ton of additional information. We have temperature, cloud cover percentage, wind speed and direction, humidity, visibility, snow depth. All of this comes from real weather data, not TSW's in-game weather, so it's not limited to what the game can actually simulate. Individual parts can be toggled on or off in the settings if you don't want certain info cluttering the screen. We also have weather codes, which are now parsed and displayed too, which will show conditions at the start and end of each hour. If the weather's stable, only one code will show up. So cloud cover mapping was improved in this version as well. Before, it was a 1-to-1 mapping where 80% cloud cover meant the slider was set to 80%, but the in-game sky is fully overcast at 80%, so this resulted in more clouds than real life. Now, the mapping better matches reported percentages, with the in-game slider maxing at 85% in dry weather, and the remaining 15% is actually added based on precipitation. The app now forces reported precipitation into TSW, so if it's snowing or raining according to the weather data, it'll show up in game. This is especially helpful for scenarios where it is potentially snowing while being above freezing. And if that is the case, and there have been many that I have played through, you will see that accurately reflected. There's also a really clever feature for tunnels now when you're in an annotated selected tunnel, the tool will query weather at the tunnel exit instead of your current position. That way you're not getting mountain peak weather when you're underground. Now, for longer tunnels, which are over 1 kilometer in length, the app forces an instant weather update when you're inside, so you can exit into completely different conditions than when you entered. That is especially realistic for routes with mountain ranges, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit more later on in this video. One great route to test this out is on Castle to Wurzburg. So now version 3.5.1 was a quick fix for the moderate snow icon, which had been displaying incorrectly. 3.5.2 brought permanent overlay mode, so you can now set the weather overlay to stay visible at all times instead of only appearing at stations. This version also fixed the discrepancy between weather codes and visible precipitation, which had been causing some confusion. Version 3.5.3 tackled a very major bug, one that I was very happy to send in my own reports and experience to help resolve. Now, with this bug, snow or rain would just cut out visually even though the sliders showed it should be there. I spent a lot of time documenting this with videos showing how exactly to reproduce it, and very happy to say that here it has been fixed. The issue is actually tied to the amount of TSW API calls being made, so Windsorton lowered that frequency and it resolved the problem. Now, if you're using smoothed update values at or below 2 seconds, you might still run into issues, but the recommended 3-second setting works great. I have mine set to 5 seconds and I haven't personally seen this issue pop up. And then while I was working on this video, version 3.5.4 was actually pushed live. This one includes some really important movements. The way the app queries data from TSW has been reworked to use subscriptions, which should make the connection more reliable overall. Menu state detection has been improved as well, so all overlays should now be properly hidden in the main menu, and that was a little quirk that needed addressing. So happy that's fixed here. There's a new snow precipitation multiplier in the settings that lets you fine-tune the amount of snow particles in-game. Historic weather now uses local route time, which time zone offsetting handled by the Open Medio service. This fixes issues where wrong UTC times were being used for routes with incorrectly defined time zones, Köln-Aachen being one example of that. And the weather overlay now shows your current elevation above sea level, which updates when you're sat in the cab. Now, beyond all of these updates, performance across the board has been drastically improved. Sliders increment by just 1%, clouds are 0.1%, which gives you much smoother transitions overall. The API is only called when values actually change, so stable weather means very little API activity. Temperature and piled snow update every 30 seconds since they don't have much visual impact anyway. There's also a weather smoothing option with a configurable timer. The recommended setting is 3 seconds or above to keep things stable, and there's a warning built into the settings to prevent pushing the API too hard, which is a really nice safety feature. But remember, again, if you set those values below the recommended, you could run into that issue that I talked about earlier with the disappearing precipitation VFX, which could occur with either rain or snow. You can now customize the overlay's position now using alignment and margin settings, and you can adjust the background to be semi-transparent if you want better visibility. And I just really need to express how game-changing this tool is, especially with all of the recent updates. It completely destroys the need for dynamic weather. I feel like with Dovetail's dynamic weather, things just don't really move in a way that feels realistic or accurate to real life. And with the way that weather actually operates, pulling from real conditions, you see some incredible visuals now within TSW, things that you really wouldn't see too often, or at least weather changing in a realistic way that you will see with this tool. It is just insane, some of the visuals that I've seen. I was driving Castle to Wurzburg, going into a tunnel, coming out and having almost no visibility, going into another tunnel again and coming out and having tons of visibility because I had changed in elevation, because there was a change in temperature temperature and in humidity. I noticed the clouds were also changing and the sun was rising while all of this was happening. So it just created some spectacular views. Then when arriving at my final station, even though it hadn't rained, I noticed that all the platforms were very wet, and that was because of the condensation and the humidity. And all of that can be seen, which just completely changes the experience. So, TSW has a great weather system. The whole thing with Todd 4 really is awesome, but it's just sad that Dovetail never really fully utilized that to its maximum potential, and it's definitely being put to work here with this tool. Now, I do want to acknowledge the work that has gone into this. Winterton has been incredibly responsive to feedback. Detailed bug reports from the community have been met with very quick patches, lots of engagement, especially positive engagement. And if you are using this tool, I definitely encourage you to jump onto the forums and share your experiences, and also maybe any improvements that you have too. I will have that linked in the description box below. The more feedback Winterton gets, the better this tool can become for everyone. Now, I want to talk about some smaller tweaks and improvements that could make this tool even better than it already is, and these are more minor ideas, but I always like thinking about ways to refine something that is already great. The first one has to do with the weather icons themselves. I love the current implementation of how it shows the general change in weather over time for a specific location. Of course, that's always going to shift as you move through the map, so just because the overlay says the sun is turning into rain doesn't always mean that you'll actually experience that transition while you're driving. Now, if you stayed stationary, maybe you would, but when you're moving, especially at higher speeds, that is going to be changing constantly depending on the region that you're in. Still, I really like that it reflects what's happening in the world around you. But now, one thing I have noticed a lot during nighttime drives, especially with those weather codes, is that the sun icon still appears even when it's dark. Now, I understand this is meant to represent clear or mostly clear conditions, and that does make sense, but I think it would feel a lot more natural if maybe it switched to a moon at night. Now, I'm not sure if sunrise or sunset data is included on the site Winterton uses to pull the weather data from, but if it is, I think it would be really neat to have the icon change based on those times. For example, showing a moon instead of a sun when it's before sunrise or after sunset, especially for the clear, mostly clear, or partly clear weather codes. That obviously wouldn't make a difference for the fog or cloudy ones because they don't have a sun or moon present in them regardless. Now, something else I really noticed, especially on the Castle to Würzburg route in one of my recent runs, because of the elevation changes, you get massive swings in temperature, which then affect humidity and then fog density. It is really amazing to see how all of this is reflected in the sim yet once again. Sometimes I'll go from more than 15 miles of visibility to less than 1/10 of a mile in the next update. This is especially striking when driving through tunnels. You'll enter one with very clear visibility and exit into extremely thick fog, way thicker than you would ever see with dynamic weather within the sim. And thanks to recent improvements, those updates now happen faster and even process while you're inside the tunnel, which I do have to say is a huge leap forward. But with that said, I have noticed that with tunnels that are right on the edge of meeting the length requirement to trigger that update, you can sometimes see the weather visibility changing right as you exit. I was thinking it might help if the transition triggered as soon as you entered the tunnel instead of several seconds later. Maybe that would give shorter tunnels enough time to process the new weather before you come out the other side. Now, for most tunnels, this isn't an issue since they are long enough, but the shorter ones that barely make that requirement again definitely make that visual transition noticeable. Now, I've also noticed that some tunnels on Castle to Würzburg, for example, don't meet that threshold at all, so they don't trigger weather updates inside, and that can make big fog changes between the two updates stand out a lot more. And when having weather update every 5 minutes and transition every 5 seconds over that 5-minute window, I have noticed that the first half of a fog transition looks smooth, but towards the end, the progression curve feels a bit steeper, which makes the shift a lot more visible, almost like instant flashes every 5 seconds as the newer, more dense fog kicks in. I think if fog transitions were handled in a linear way instead of a curve, it could make them feel a bit more natural. And if it's technically possible, I think having fog update a bit more frequently than the rest of the weather might help with that too, since it has the biggest visual impact on immersion other than cloud cover. I'm not sure if this would even be possible, but I've noticed that fog generally looks fine during moderate visibility swings. For example, going from 15 miles to 8 miles of visibility feels very natural, especially happening over a 5-minute window with updates every 5 seconds. So keeping that time frame for all of these examples, going from 15 miles to 8 miles of visibility feels completely natural, since the difference mostly affects distant scenery. The same goes for smaller shifts like 8 miles to 5 miles. I feel like it transitions smoothly and isn't really noticeable. Where it becomes more visible is once you drop below around 5 miles of visibility. When you're making big jumps like from 5 miles to 2 miles or from 5 miles to 1 mile, or in some instances that I have personally seen, moving from 5 miles down to a 1/10 of a mile, that is when those transitions really stand out, especially towards the end of the update window when the change seems to accelerate. Maybe there could be some sort of logic where the denser the fog becomes, the more gradually and frequently those updates occur. That way the visual change feels smoother and less abrupt. Now, this is not something that happens all the time since super dense fog isn't that common, but for those moments like on Castle to Wurzburg, for example, when it does appear, I think that kind of refinement could make the transitions look a lot more natural. And lastly, I would love to see the POI overlay get the same customization options as the weather overlay. I absolutely love the ability to toggle between solid and transparent backgrounds for the weather display. But right now the POI overlay doesn't match those settings, and I think it would be great if both overlays shared the same customization options, so you could keep a consistent look across both. And with how I have it set up now for the weather overlay, it's kind of mimicking the TSW UI color scheme, so it really fits perfectly in with that track monitor on the top right, and I would love if the POI overlay did the same on the top left. But these are just some thoughts on how to, take something that is already very, very excellent, very well done, and just make it even better. The tool is already transforming how weather works in TSW. It is a must-have. I highly recommend it. And if you have any other suggestions for improvements or any questions, definitely head over to the forums. I'll have that linked below, but I'm curious on what you guys think about this tool. Have you downloaded it? Have you given it a try? What are your thoughts? Has it changed your experience as well? That's gonna be it from me for this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. Take care and happy rail simming, guys.